Namaskar and welcome back to Media Scan, your weekend dose of headlines, controversies and perspectives. What an amazing response our citizens have given to the Tiranga campaign. This and a lot more on the media's week-long analysis of the Prime Minister's address from Red Fort in today's Independence Week special episode of Media Scan. But first, what made news? In this Amrit Kal, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has proposed 5 pledges to all Indians in order to ensure our country scales the pinnacle of glory in 2047. In these pledges, which he termed as Panch Pran, PM Modi stressed on unity, taking pride in our glory, getting rid of all signs of slavery and the need to recognize the duties of all citizens, including Prime Ministers and Chief Ministers. A big highlight of his address was the thrust on weeding out corruption and dynastic politics, which he termed as the biggest threats to our democracy. The unprecedented response to the Tiranga campaign in the run-up to the Independence Day has left even the staunchest critics speechless. The amazing enthusiasm and the kind of electric energy it generated has proved that even those with limited means want to be at the forefront in showing their affection and loyalty to the nation. Bike rallies, Tiranga marches, Prabhat ferries and runs were organized everywhere. But it was the tricolour fluttering in every household that really has defined this iconic campaign. The Nitish Tejaswi cabinet came under fire right after its expansion earlier this week. The biggest controversy erupted over the choice of the new Law Minister Kartikeya Singh, who took oath exactly on the day when he was to surrender in a court for a kidnapping case. But that wasn't all. Association for Democratic Reforms, that is ADR data, shows 72% ministers in the new Mahagathbandhan cabinet have declared criminal or grave criminal cases against them. This and a spate of criminal incidents like killing and kidnapping prompted the media to run headlines asking whether this was the return of Jungle Raj in Bihar. A political war has erupted over the CBI's raids at multiple locations in Delhi, including the residence of Deputy CM Manish Sisodia. CBI has been investigating the corruption in the new excise policy of the Delhi government, which has since been discontinued. The AAP leadership termed it as political vendetta. However, CBI has claimed a whole lot of evidence of favouring selected vendors. A number of senior excise officers of the Delhi government are also being investigated. Opposition parties have questioned the release of the 11 convicts of the Bilkis Bano rape case in Gujarat. They criticized the release on the ground that the provisions for remission of sentence must not apply to such a heinous crime. The convicts were released following the decision of a committee which grants remission of sentence to convicts on various considerations such as old age, health, good behavior, etc. The Bilkis Bano rape case was one of the most talked about incidents of violence in the 2002 riots. After those headlines, we come to the dominant media narrative of this special Independence Week. All through the week, viewers, you have read on the print media, watched on television and followed on the digital platforms how political pundits tried to analyze, to break down and to give their own perspective on the Prime Minister's very interesting address from the Red Fort early on in the week. The most of the media's thrust was mainly on the issues of corruption and dynasty which were raised by the Prime Minister. So, is corruption and dynasty the two most feared and biggest threats for our democracy? And what about the other 5 resolves which have been put forward by the Prime Minister in this Amrit Kal of India's democracy, that is the Panch Pran. To understand these issues and the media's take on the subject, I have two very senior academicians, commentators here on Media Scan this evening. I have here with me Professor Geeta Bhatt, well-known professor of history, an academic from the Delhi University, and very articulate on her views on current politics with a historical perspective and other issues of politics and current affairs. Welcome back to Media Scan, Dr. Geeta Bhatt.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Smita.
And also here with me this evening, Professor Heeraman Tiwari, senior academician of the History Department in the Jawaharlal Nehru University. You have heard him on various earlier occasions on Media Scan. He will be able to tell us what exactly he thinks on this speech of the Prime Minister and whether the media got it right. Welcome back, Professor Heeraman Tiwari.
Thank you, Smita ji.
And Professor Tiwari, my first question is also to you, sir. Frankly, most of the headlines following the Prime Minister's address were focused, as I said, on his thrust on corruption and dynasty. The question on Media Scan today is, are corruption and dynasty the biggest threats to democracy in our country? And if so, why would you say it is?
Thank you, Smita ji. It's always a pleasure to be on your shows. As you said, it was not only a historic speech in the sense that 75 years have just passed of our independence. And as the Prime Minister has been describing for a long time, that we are now entering into the Amrita Kal, the period of the nectar, if you like. And in that sense, he defined what the vision of his government and of this country should be. And you're also right that the media has focused on a certain aspect. As you mentioned, that corruption and dynasty, Parivarvad, are eating into the vitals of our democracy. Now, if you look at the entire speech, he in fact, what he called, and a very beautiful term, many people call it Pancha Prana, I take it as Pancha Prana, which is the vitals of 5 vitals that are required. Either way you look at it, Prana and Prana, they both mean the same thing. And if you look at the corruption, and corruption actually eats into the vitals of democratic traditions. And once democracy is somehow harmed, the entire system of development, to look at it, how he wants to talk about it, development, then of course, shaking off every trace of civility or colonial past, not feeling, overawed by colonial masters and whatever they have left behind. The third is, of course, confidence in oneself and in one's civilization and roots and the unity of all India, and finally the sacred sense of duty. So I think all 5 Prana and Pran are revolving around what is his main concern, the Prime Minister's main concern, which he outlined from the ramparts of the Red Fort on 15th August, are basically saving democracy, and through democracy, through unity, through development, through self-confidence, and through pride in our past, we can move ahead and become a developed nation. That is the first prana or prana, that is it.
I will come back to the Panch Pran also, Professor Tiwari, but before that I just wanted to have a take from Professor Geeta Bhatt on the importance of discussing the challenges of corruption and dynasty at this stage in our political history, and also the fact that why the Prime Minister was so insistent on talking about our duties, including the duties of people in positions like the Prime Minister and Chief Ministers, not to speak of everything, when it comes to the future, the vision of the country. Professor Bhatt.
Smita, thank you so much for inviting me to your program. Definitely, the Prime Minister's speech from the ramparts of Red Fort was one of the finest speeches ever made. And it was a speech which laid down the roadmap of the future of the country. It was, it was his clarion call for the collective spirit of the 130 crore Indians to move together to make the country prosperous, to make the country confident, and developed, as Heeraman ji also said, in the next 25 years. I think, his thrust on the Panch, the 5 promises, which he has requested the nation to stand by, and also at the same time accepting the limitations that we have seen in the society in terms of the way governance has been and how corruption and dynasty kind of overruled everything else. And at the same time he also proposed the solutions to the existing problems and inspiring the people of the country.
So, Professor Geeta Bhatt, for the benefit of our viewers, ma'am, allow me to intervene for a second here. From the direction of your analysis, I gather, for the benefit of our viewers, I would like to ask you whether you are trying to say that the challenges flagged by the Prime Minister of corruption and dynasty, it is actually from these challenges from which his Panch Pran, they are supposed to flow. Is that so?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Smita ji. And the whole thrust on his Panch Pran is actually to eliminate this dynastic culture and the corruption which has been part of governance for a very, very long time in this country. I would like to just give one small example here. And why is it so is that when the Prime Minister is asking for these Panch Prans, these 5 promises, I think he himself has set a benchmark in developing, in terms of developing these 5 strands. One small example I would like to quote here: when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, his thrust on good governance, because any government, any leadership which talks about good governance, definitely good governance is going to eliminate corruption and will sideline dynasty or sycophancy in any system. Whenever there used to be every year, certain number of IAS and IPS officers, they go to each of the states. Whenever he used to receive a letter from the central government, he personally used to write a letter to all these, incumbent officers who were going to join the cadre, the Gujarat cadre, where he used to write a personalized letter, send them Gujarat, maps of Gujarat and other status parameters, along with a CD of Gujarati language, literature, so they are well apprised, and also send a book called Minor Hints.
This synergy between the political leadership and the bureaucracy, which is actually given the job of implementing the vision and the policies of the government, it is this kind of synergy which makes our democracy really fruitful, for the citizens. But there is one aspect of the Panch Pran, Professor Bhatt, on which I would like to have Professor Tiwari's perspective as well.
If you could give me 10 seconds and
yes,
if I could just complete it. Yeah, I just wanted to say that he used to send a book called Minor Hints to all these officers, which was written by the Diwan of Vadodara, who was the Diwan of the Maharaja Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III. And these were small notes and were very precise notes on the way, on polity, on administration, on welfare. So these are some of the examples which show that the Prime Minister himself is leading. A leader is the one who guides his people by self-example.
Precisely, so, Dr. Bhatt,
yes,
and we have various anecdotes to prove how meticulously Prime Minister tries to involve himself in the day-to-day governance, not just to frame policies and give a vision. But coming back to Professor Tiwari, sir, you were discussing with me the Panch Pran in your first opening remarks. There is one particular pledge among the Panch Pran which I especially want to discuss with you, sir, since you are a scholar of history. The Prime Minister was wants that the citizens should learn to take pride in India's glory, in our heritage, in our culture. Now the question here is, sir, that we are used to hearing about policies and programs and various schemes and issues of governance in the Independence Day speeches by Prime Ministers. Why do you think PM Modi had to bring in this issue of taking pride in our glory? Why is it relevant at this point of time, sir? And have you heard earlier Prime Ministers stress on it?
Smita as I was just briefly mentioning earlier, that the Prime Minister comes up with these beautiful mottos or mantras, as I call them, and they come out of the deep meditation, rumination that he has of the problems of the country, because he's the leader of the country. So when he comes up with these lines, they are fully processed in his mind, and therefore when he talks about taking pride into our past, into our culture, into our civilization, into our history, because our culture, civilization and history are very, very rich. The reason being, for 300 odd years that India has been studied by the West, whether it is Europe or even America, the way Indian past has been portrayed, and also, unfortunately, in last 75 years, 7 decades and more, our Indian historians, political scientists, I'm not blaming them, the kind of historical narrative that they have, they were attracted to, or they built upon, and they fed, because that is the most important aspect when you write books and articles where the school children, college students study, and this is how they begin to think.
But Professor Tiwari, I understand that you would not like to blame the academicians or policymakers.
Of course, I would blame
you must
the
have the curiosity, sir. Why do you think it was like this? There must have been reason.
I'm not shirking. I would blame the academics, historians, political philosophers, but blaming in the sense that chote muh badi baat, and it's easy to blame. My point is that it is there for all of us to see how the history has been narrated, what kind of civilization that we have had. Pick up any civilization, whether it's Sindhu Saraswati Sabhyata or our libraries thousands of years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, was so rich. Look at the other parts of the world, how they were doing it, what kind of life they were living in. In any case, what out of the 5 Pran or 5 resolves that he talks about, the central resolve is that once we are confident about our past, once we are confident about ourselves, shake away the burden, or what I call the Macaulay's kind of attitude that we have, that unless the West teaches us, we cannot really be civilized and progressing. If we shake that off and feel confident, then whatever we do, it will really give fruitful results.
And in fact, an important element of the Panch Pran that the Prime Minister articulated was that, to completely do off with every sign, every sign of slavery. Yes, sir, please make your point.
Because 10 seconds, because the most important, of course, these Panch Prana 5 resolve that he comes up with, this is first of all a beautiful line. But what he also said along with that, if you remember, and what touched me most in that speech, and as Geeta ji said, it is not only a historic and momentous speech, it is one of the best, and I can't think of any, I haven't heard any other Prime Minister give such a speech, which is really shearing and heart-wrenching. His throat was choked, he stopped in the middle.
So let me bring in Professor Bhatt, as you are mentioning.
How do we respect our women? Our women are mothers and sisters.
Allow me to bring in Professor Bhatt here. Professor Geeta Bhatt, while we were discussing the Panch Pran just now, there was one very interesting element in the speech where the Prime Minister almost choked with emotion, was his point on how we treat women in the society, in our behavior, in our language even. And he was very, very clear about saying that this is one thing that we must completely shed at this point of history in our democracy. Professor Bhatt, what did you feel when you heard the Prime Minister speak about restoring and bringing back the dignity of women in our language and in our day-to-day behavior?
Prime Minister has time and again brought this very, very important and sensitive issue in front of the people of the country, and that is respecting women in the thoughts and in their language, in their conduct. Earlier also, if you remember, from the ramparts of Red Fort, he had spoken about that why do we need to tell our daughters how they need to conduct themselves?
It was the first speech from the Red Fort.
We need to ask them that where they have been and what have been their conduct. So when he raised that
this was in fact his first speech, Professor Bhatt, which he addressed from the Red Fort.
Right. So, once again when he talked, and he brought up, these are small issues if one thinks, but actually they put such deep impressions on the minds of the people when we use different type of words which are very derogatory to women in our daily language, in common parlance. When in society such type of words are used, they definitely bear consequences when people try to look and have their communication with women in the society. So this is something which has been appreciated across in the universities. Like in my university also, I have seen large number of students, especially not only girls but even boys as students, were very appreciative of the fact that this is something which they themselves have not realized and have been using these type of words in their common conduct and language.
Professor Bhatt, you are saying that young women and students were quite excited to hear the Prime Minister mention this in his address. But I am reminded of some columns in newspapers and comments by people on television who were quite skeptical about the fact whether this was really a subject to be raised in the I-Day speech. What would you say to that?
Well, when for the very first time when Prime Minister Modi spoke from the Red Fort, he had talked about something which considered as small as how the country has to be kept clean.
Yes.
And this was something it is something so small, but it talks about the character of the society. That if we cannot keep our neighborhood clean, if we cannot keep our streets clean, it talks about our societal character, the character of the society. And that is something which is very important, which will go a very long way in defining that how we will be as a society, in the coming decades or in the coming centuries.
So on this point, Professor Bhatt, I am reminded of one more point of criticism vis-a-vis the Prime Minister's speech, on which I would like to get a take from Professor Tiwari quickly before we run out of time. Professor Heeraman Tiwari, there was a lot of questioning, sir, on the Prime Minister's I-Day speech, where people, they have questioned the vision, and this I saw particularly from the ecosystem fueled by the opposition parties, most particularly the Congress, about the Prime Minister's, the roadmap, the vision he has articulated for the next 25 years when India will reach 100 years of independence. That is when Prime Minister Modi wants us to achieve the pinnacle of our glory. But the point of criticism being articulated is, we are used to governments having a 5-year vision, thinking of the next election down the road, how to get victory in the next elections. So they are questioning this 25-year vision of various issues, most particularly that the Prime Minister, wants to give the impression of a longer political rule or whatever. Is that even an argument?
See, Smita ji, should we even be surprised by this kind of comment? Of course, you have 30-year plan, 50-year plan. It doesn't really mean that somebody wants to hang on there. If the people of the country, the voters decide whatever they decide, that will happen. But I want to come back to the point that what Prime Minister every year after year, this is the 9th speech. I can't remember even one speech in last 9 speeches where he has not kept the issues of our women, our most vital, important part of our society in mind. So when he talked about the dignity of women in the first speech, and then he went about education and empowerment, every year this is much more subtle. What he talked about this year was the language, how we communicate not only to women but among ourselves. In what way do we do? So being civil, being respectful is not an optional extra, it is mandatory. And I can't think of a single gali in my life. I can't think of a single gali which does not point to denigration of women, and which is what he was talking about, that we have to be changing what the language of our discourse, the grammar of our thinking, and then only can we reach to a level, and which is, I think, much more subtle, much more deep than what we have been reading and listening to in the media. As far as the 25-year plans are concerned, of course the country will go on, politicians will come and go. You have to have a vision. You have to have a vision to see a country which is developed as any country in the world.
Professor Geeta Bhatt, you just heard Professor Tiwari articulate his takeaway from the I-Day speech of the Prime Minister. In 30 seconds, madam, if you could also share with us your perspective about what it was that you actually took away or you will remember for a long time from this speech earlier this week.
Because I think his Panch, Pran, the 5 promises which he has requested this nation, they will go a long way. As Heeraman ji said, governments will come and governments will go. But it is these 5 promises which, if they can become our national character, then I think India, as we aspire that we will be the Vishwaguru, I think on that path we will be able to walk the talk if we are able to inculcate and make these 5 promises to the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Dr. Geeta Bhatt.
After all, he called India
yes,
the mother
sir.
of democracy.
Quickly, please.
And he called India the mother of democracy, of course. And in it, inheres everything that he had in his mind for the next 25 years for this country.
And in fact, every article, every sentence, every point that the Prime Minister flagged in his speech was actually focused and aimed at strengthening our democracy, our democratic institutions. But on that note, I am afraid I must thank both my guests this evening for sharing their perspective so well with us. I am running out of time, so allow me to thank Professor Heeraman Tiwari for joining our show at such a short notice in this very important week. Thank you, sir, and we shall contact you once again. Also, Professor Geeta Bhatt, thank you, ma'am, for joining us on the show and sharing your arguments, your perspective with us. It was really, really fruitful.
Thank you.
Viewers, 2 things come out very clearly from our brief discussion this evening. As Professor Geeta Bhatt said, the Panch Pran, the pledges forwarded by the Prime Minister and his thrust on weeding out corruption and dynasty politics actually flow from each other, and it was naive for the media or any of us to separate the 2 issues as different watertight subjects. The other issue being that the Prime Minister's roadmap for the next 25 years is what is going to take us to the pinnacle of glory by strengthening democracy down to the last citizen in India. On that note, it's a wrap up on Media Scan for this evening, but do keep watching DD India as we shall continue to scan the media for you. Namaskar.